Welcome back. I am again with John Engle. He's with the New Institute, New Hegemony Institute, and there were some issues that were pending on from our previous conversation. It happened that when I was editing the video, I realized that I have made a very clumsy job at defending my point, not because of the facts, but because of the way I had articulated them. And because I am a sore loser, I would like to just retake our previous conversation with one point before moving to what has convoked us today. You in our previous conversation, you said that the most intelligent strategy with respect to Ukraine would be used to bleed Russia, but in the end, to let Russia carry the burden of reconstructing Ukraine. And I was opposed to that idea. So before I just want to make, I would like just to make one point to defend uh, my position, but in a much more articulated way.
Sure.
Is first of all, if we lose Ukraine, besides the moral argument that is that in 1994 they gave up their nuclear weapons in exchange of guarantees that we gave the Ukrainians and that we apparently are not willing to respect now. Besides that moral point, you have that without, if we let Ukraine go, with Ukraine would go the one of the basis that would give more credibility to Europe's attempt at overhauling their defense system. Why? Because the Ukraine has proven to be a very effective test lab for new weapons and tactics, which Europe doesn't have. Besides, Ukraine has proven to be a 1 million army of seasoned soldiers, which in the case of Europe, they are not willing to deploy or they are not even prepared to deploy. I don't know if you are aware of the experience, the sad experience of the 155 and 157 brigades trained by the French, which failed miserably. Why? Because they didn't lack the seasoned soldiers that in better conditions should have been rotated from the main front to these new units, and so they were destroyed very easily by the Russians. Besides that, is the issue of the prestige. I still remember Prime Minister Ichibas words about Europe. How could we trust Europe if Europe cannot, NATO, if NATO is not even willing to defend Ukraine from the Russians? And if we let Ukraine fall, with Ukraine would go what remains of the credibility of Europe. And besides that, one more point is you said that the Europeans have committed 800 billion euros and they would have to spend them anyway. Yes, but they may waste them. They may waste them because that's Europe has not, without the this test lab of innovation that is and that is putting pressure on Europe to really move their sclerotic articulations in defense. Most probably that the money is going to be either wasted or spent in American weapons, which will not help them to be more self-reliant when it comes to defense. And all that to save us a Marshall Plan for Ukraine is not worth it. What's your take?
Well, I mean, I think there's a few points in there worth addressing. Like, firstly, when you talk about, this like Ukraine being like a useful test bed for sort of next gen military doctrine and strategy, like that's absolutely been true. But I would suggest that that is not sort of an end in itself. Like, I wouldn't articulate that as like an advantage of continuing the war because it's sort of, especially because it sort of uh, undermines any moral point, suggesting that it is worth using an entire country as like essentially lab rats for next gen military doctrine, but which I think like you run into like the danger of doing when we start talking about the war in that context. However, I'd also suggest that if there is a fear that European military spending will be insufficient and that the political will for sufficient and efficient military spending is a risk, then having Europe largely on the hook for $1 trillion rebuilding of Ukraine post war will almost certainly reduce any inducement or incentive to make that investment so like those are the key issues that will be created that are worth like considering like in contra to sort of the point like the argument you just articulated.
Yeah, but in the case of Ukraine, that if they find that they have a comparative advantage on defense, and that this is not a substitute but a complement of Europe's, and we look at what happened after World War II. It took more than 4 decades for Europe to repay the Marshall Plan. So Ukraine would have the means to pay in a few decades the Marshall Plan. They could not regardless of whether or when or where, excuse me, regardless of where the border limit ends up being at the end of the war. The matter is that it's not worth letting Ukraine fall. It's the experience of World War II is as if after World War II we would have said, or reconstructing Germany and is going to be too expensive. Let's better take the other half of let's better take the Russians the other half of Germany and let's save that. It would have made no sense, right? Because we know that Germany could have been a source of a lot of prestige and power if given a chance to rebuild under a new regime, of course.
Well, I mean, like the problem there is like just coming up against the Marshall Plan was paid for by the like gigantic peace dividend of the United States. Like there is no pool of capital to pay for that. Like in this instance, but it's not coming from America, so it would have to come from Europe, at least in large
Mm,
part. Like I don't see the
defense.
current administration or the next or even a putative democratic one being like putting anywhere near the sort of money that would be needed to rebuild Ukraine. But like, from a like just like sort of like pure like military outcomes standpoint, like where I mean like the Russians are grinding the Ukrainians down. At what point do we say are you willing to countenance like NATO member states joining the fight directly? Like because that creates significant escalation risks.
Well, that's a problem that is still unsolved because as far as I don't know if Mercer, at least he has proposed to create a mandatory draft in Germany, but I don't know if the other countries, the other big countries like France and the UK are going to go along. Who definitely is going to go along are the countries in Eastern Europe from Poland to the Baltic states.
Yeah, but like all like so I mean with Germany and France and the UK to like a slightly lesser but still important sense. You know, these are all countries like in significant demographic decline, like very little political will for boots on the ground war themselves. You know, it's like the militarization of those countries is going to be like a slow process. I mean, the Bundeswehr, like the amount of money that the Germans have now promised to put into their military will barely be a band-aid for the decades of neglect that they've put into like their military apparatus. But like these are
Mm,
all issues that do need to be resolved. But I mean, like there's no appetite for, and I would, and
I, I
you'd
agree.
see.
I agree on that, but and yet it depends on the circumstances. Remember how America was before the 1939. There was a country with, traumatized by the scars of World War One. FDR had a very hard work turning the tide against isolationism, and yet he did.
Yeah, but we were a much younger, much more economically developed, like economically dynamic country by the time at that point. Like we had, and what we were directly attacked, and there was an ability to fill a vacuum that was happening like in like world politics at the time, where there was an actual world conflict happening, as opposed to a regional war of choice. I think people get less are going to be less enthused, and it's harder to get people excited about a military intervention that is not existential to themselves.
What what we probably can agree is that, and even scholars like Jack Watling from the RUSI would agree, is that in the end it will depend on Europe, because the circumstances are there for there to defend Ukraine, because by doing so they are defending their own self-interest. But if we see more of what has happened in the Hague, that they are just setting a 5% that is unrealistic, and not setting the basic guidelines to overhaul, to excuse me, to consolidate the fragmented
Mhm.
European defense industry, then yeah, I would have to agree that we are going to go nowhere. But you said that you wanted to go to talk about procurement, so let's use that opportunity to talk about procurement in Europe. What update could you bring us about Europe? What progress are they making to consolidate, or at least to regionally specialize their defense industry so they can be up to the task?
Well, that's sort of an interesting question because, there's one of the things that the Ukraine war has done is bring some uh, sort of munitions and war material production back online that had been idled for decades. Interestingly, like in places like Germany, in like parts of Germany, you're seeing that, and there is an open question about what would happen if the war in Ukraine ended and like those places had to shutter again. So there's a lot of unanswered questions. They're very good at setting goals without a ton of extra action, and it's been one of the big problems for the EU as an institution from like the sort of the very beginning of the European project. That Europe, at least mainland Europe and Western Europe, understand intellectually that they can't project power or really defend themselves individually as countries, and the collective defense is critical. It's one of the things that makes NATO such an important uh, structuring force, like in that, like across like the European and transatlantic alliance system that exists. But the biggest problem is that just production and industrial production uh, is uh, very significant competitive disadvantages that have been building up over time, like across Europe. A lot of Germany's like strengths traditionally have been in, especially the higher end uh, manufacturing, like their automotive sector. Uh, but a lot of these advantages are dissipating, and as population sort of pressure like becomes an issue with an aging population, putting additional pressure on them. Like is like a ticking clock, but also just a need to recalibrate based on what their future demography is going to actually be. It's one of those issues that countries don't like to talk about being smaller and weaker than they were, a generation earlier, but that's essentially guaranteed for all Western European countries. Like basically, like the only country in the EU that I believe that has like a above replacement rate birth rate is Ireland, a very small country in
Mhm.
the EU project. So I mean, like from a ability to to do that, like there have been efforts. It's been over a decade since the European project, the EU like tried to do some integration of military force. Like there was the effort by like to create like the sort of like joint units. I think you were talking about that briefly. Um, those joint military units like are like even then we're talking about you know tens of thousands, not even hundreds of thousands of troops. So not a lot going on there. But on the procurement side, one of the big issues now that the UK leaving the EU didn't really help this issue, but it may help in a few in some other ways. In that the UK has traditionally been a uh, sort of frenemy of the European project. So the hope, and there is at least some movement on the positive side of uh, the sort of continental Western European powers in the EU doing a little bit more coordination and specialization. The issue is that, as with any country that has a long history and a sense of its own identity and nationhood, it's difficult to get them to give up their own domestic, um, like exclusively domestic military uh, programs. There is they all want to have their own uh, principal weapon systems. At least the EU, for the most part, have systematized things like small arms and like combat rifles. Like they almost all have like significant cross compatibility. Something that's been proven quite effective when looking at the experience of some of those weapons, especially like slightly older generation models in the in use in Ukraine. Like you also have things uh, like sort of large scale buying of the F-35, like the and other sort of like large big ticket next generation like fighter and aircraft and other armor material like coming from like the U.S. in the case of the F-35, but it's like basically joint international programs that can create shared platforms. Like that's ultimately where the best procurement efforts can happen. One of the big problems though with those is that in some of those cases, the F-35 again being an example here, uh, becoming just ruinously expensive at the per unit cost, and this is an issue that the U.S. is now facing and that Europe has to face in its own ways as it decides what it wants its military sort of posture to be, is that spending an enormous amount of money on a small arsenal of like high end munitions means that you're going to end up burning through a lot of that very quickly. And it's been interesting. I mean, it's really shown the limitations of that military philosophy. You see that like in the Strait of Hormuz incident that just like happened like around the time when we were speaking last, that uh, Iran and even Yemen were able to essentially you know not hold off but had to be opposed by three carrier strikers, so basically having to mobilize like a large part of our like global power projection capacity for what was ultimately like a small regional conflict. And even then, we saw like rapid depletion of interceptor missiles and just the high cost of firing. When each rocket's got a seven figure price tag, that price runs up extremely quickly, and you end up running out of those munitions. There's a lot of military history. Almost every war has ultimately been determined by what used to be referred to as volume of fire, like the ability to shoot more munitions at the enemy than they could shoot at you for a longer period of time has traditionally been uh, the sort of final decider of most uh, total war conflicts.
And yet, for instance, in 2023, you must remember that even the Pentagon was neglecting the issue of, and today I would say, is neglected the issue of drones and electronic warfare. And yet, drones have caused 80% of Russian casualties. So there is a role, I believe, for every country. For instance, the smaller countries in Europe are not going to be able to invest in fiber optic drones because that requires a much heavier investment. That would something that should rely on the shoulders of Germany. In the case of the coverage for replace Starlink if necessary, that's something that should rely on France if they expand the coverage of Intelsat. And yet, what my problem is that it's not much what you mentioned before demographics, because also the Russians are facing a demographic problem. The Chinese are facing a demographic problem. The main issue is will and how fast they are going to be able to react if it's necessary, if a response is necessary, because the West in general, the United States included, have had to learn lots of things from the Ukrainian war about what works and what doesn't work, even what works with the Russian weapons, like in the case of Kursk and the fiber optic drones. But the problem is not that the tools are not there. The problem is the will to precisely uh, tackle those petty interests of local defense contractors that compete with defense contractors in other European countries, and set rules for consolidation or at least specialization, coordination, right?
Yes, and I think there's I think that has always been a major issue. Political will has never really matched the rhetoric in terms of like real political will in the sense of the ability to actually get people like both in government and uh like the general public of these countries to commit to these sort of uh programs. And I mean the if you want to see the sort of let's call it probability of success, the fact that the Ukraine war, as it's ground on, has continuously lost sort of public support, like not only in the U.S. but in like Western Europe, it implies that the political will is is quite finite for any sort of military question.
The political will is limited, but and still you have to take into account in the case of the United States, the poor, extremely weak narrative proposed by Biden, the good guy as helping the small guy, instead of framing it in the terms of the interest of the United States, which is overburden Russia could screw up with our foreign policy and access to resources, especially in the case of the yuan song. And in the case of Europe, the support is a bit higher for Ukraine, but that's because of Putin's hybrid warfare that reminds Europeans all the time that the Russians are up to no good, right?
Well, I mean, yeah, but we spent like as in like Europe spent decades becoming an energy vassal of Russia, and we did nothing to stop it. You know, like I think that's one of the issues where we talk about either them being the good, whether the narrative you're trying to sell is the sort of like simplistic, childish way that they have, where it's like the good guy versus the bad guy. But also, even if you're talking about purely interests, it's like where were U.S. interests when uh, all these all the dominoes began, like were lined up for this? It's and those are sort of things where the people who made those decisions, men in especially in the U.S.,
Mhm.
are the same people who are still in power. So it's a difficult. If with like one of the issues I think with our so the American sort of presidential and congressional system as a whole that doesn't have uh what's commonplace in parliamentary elections where a party in power when they lose power, the other side tends to get a sufficiently large majority to sort of change policy, and then leadership within the losing party tends to go through like a total shakeup. That never happens in the U.S. I think that creates its own sort of weird problems, right? Because you
Yes,
have
if you want, they both share the same mindset. Yeah, it's just that the Democrats are the light version of the Republicans.
yeah, but not just that. It's like it's not just the same party; it's the same people, like the same like literal leaders who it's like if a political leader in the UK gets discredited, they and their like front bench will resign, and like a new leadership within the party sort of tends to take over like almost overnight. In the US, that doesn't happen. I mean, you have Nancy Pelosi still as one of the most influential Congress people, despite having had her actual you know agenda and program for government, so to speak, discredited multiple times, right?
Yeah, so you mean inside each party?
Yeah, exactly. There's no refreshment of leadership within them, which I think creates its own unique problems, like in the U.S. system. But it also makes it why it's so hard to to address issues of like international relations, where a lot of the policy that we're now reaping what our policy sowed like decades earlier. The problem is, rather than it being people inheriting that problem and thus able to address it as new like as a new issue, it is actually an old issue that these same people created, right? So I think creates a different psychological mindset to addressing these problems, because a lot of the people who are in charge in Congress were in Congress when uh, the U.S. decided to throw Russia to the wolves in the 90s. So you
Uh,
have
uh,
they've taken ownership. They have to somehow in the public eye and in their own minds justify why a litany of things that they've done that brought us here weren't wrong somehow. And I think that like really constrains the ability to uh, think clearly.
that brings me to the other point I believe you wanted to address was procurement here in the United States. And for instance, in the case of Europe, you see startling facts, like, for instance, that after 3 years of war, they haven't been able to develop a local TNT explosives production for the artillery shells. And but here in the United States, you also see that after 3 years of war, they haven't been able to wrestle the edge on electronic warfare from the Russians. And yet there are, I don't see enough investment on drones that are much more cheap and effective and much more, but and yet I see commitments to the F-47 and to Golden Dome, which is basically Reagan's Star Wars in steroids, right?
Oh yeah, I mean, it's lunatic. It's like that's the lunatic. Like it's not. That's just. It's the Golden Dome concept is just incredibly silly. I don't think it's in practice. I just don't see it going anywhere. It'll probably. I mean, like they'll probably spend a ton of money, and a lot of government contractors are gonna get paid, but it's not going to produce anything. If you I mean, look at the case of Israel, and like basically a very tiny country with a very small geographic footprint and a
Mhm.
very extensive interceptor missile battery in the form of the Iron Dome system, like it was still getting rocked like every like during the Iranian rocket attacks. Like it was still getting hit. Like it was could have been horrifically worse for them, obviously, but trying to replicate that on the scale of the entire United States or even just our coasts is is like is it's like the price tag would be obscene and the logistics of it and even the efficacy of it are so unclear that it's kind of an absurdity. But
Yeah, and the worst of all is that we should at least have the hindsight of history, because Reagan tried something like that and was ridiculed as Star Wars.
yeah, Star Wars had its own logic that kind of made sense at the time, more so than the actual technologies themselves. Like it was understood that like most of the things that were going to be spent on would later have like other applications. Some of so for example, some of the work that they did in like on directed energy and lasers have had other applications. But I agree, and like the other and the also of course with Star Wars, part of that was a game of chicken with the Soviets to get them to waste money as well as we could afford to waste money. It's actually kind of interesting. One thing that is little known is that one of the very last things that the Soviet government, like one of their last big sort of industrial investments, was in uh, like large scale neon production, which necessary for like high end chips and laser technologies. Uh, and interestingly, like that capacity is still basically what the world relies on for its neon. But the point, like, so it worked in that sense. We got them to, waste a ton of money and accelerate their downfall. But yeah, as a matter of like sort of practical military application, the Golden Dome has similar, if not worse, uh, utility to what the Star Wars program sort of envisioned. Um, but like on the broad, and it's but that feeds into sort of the broader procurement morass that like sort of afflicts.
And why do you believe the Pentagon is so inefficient? I have heard that they have not been able to pass the last 7 audits, and their attention seems to be more where more in sync with Raytheon's priorities than with defense priorities. And that's what would explain the neglect on drones and electronic warfare, right?
Well, yeah, I mean, like, there's a lot of perverse incentives that go into this, right? Like, there's, it's like some of them are psychological within the military, some of them are like matters of economics and greed. Like, it's a whole complex of factors in play. Like for example, when you're talking, like, if you're just looking at the drone question for a moment, like, there's been a sort of intellectual faction within the Air Force in particular, but the military, the Pentagon more broadly, about like the need for more drones and the conceptualizing drones as like sort of the future of aerial warfare. Uh, there's been since the beginning, I mean, since the days of the first sort of Predator drones being deployed in the Middle East, massive opposition from within the Air Force who still believe in some ways that essentially it boils down to they still believe that that you need to have the romantic ideal of these like of men flying planes into battle, and like they're still very attached to the idea of the fighter pilot and the bomber pilot, and those sort of psychological barriers are what in part like block efforts to develop and replace those things. Why we spent $1 trillion or so over decades on like the next generation fighter programs that continue to have issues, and that if we had spent the exact same amount of money on iterating multiple generations of combat drones, we'd probably have something radically more advanced and capable than what we do now.
That brings me to the point of What do you believe are the reasons in a bit more detail? What do you believe are the reasons behind this ineptitude? For instance, in the case, just one thing before you answer is, it's not that drones are strange to us, is that for instance, you must remember how during the Iraq and Afghanistan war, we used lots of drones, but we were more effective at hitting weddings than hitting actual Taliban or Sunni leaders in the insurgencies of those two countries. So what reveal a lot of a very short-sighted vision on strategy. What do you believe are the main reasons behind this inefficient or incompetent defense industry? Big but inefficient.
So there's a few things to unpack there. On the I wouldn't necessarily call like the drone warfare as it's been fought to be a case of like extreme inefficiency. Like the Predator drones of the Iraq War have obviously advanced considerably from where they are now, from where they were then. Even then, they were pretty good at like taking out targets. The problem was with target identification, and that was more often than not human error or you know willful or accidental uh, is a matter of interpretation. But honestly, like drone production and technology is one of our more efficient procurement areas compared to a lot of others. I mean, there's like so turning to like the overall issue of efficiency, like in the and runaway spending for seemingly very little power projection capacity. There's a few elements there. Like one is that if you look at the military as a whole, extremely top heavy in the sense that you have just a very very large officer and general officer corps with like lots of different commands. So you're spending a ton on personnel, a lot of it admin with the like the total number of service people in uniform versus uh, the number of basic combat soldiers and personnel is like historically unbalanced, like beyond anything that's been seen before. So like those things affect the overall sort of efficiency pyramid of like these organizations. But from the procurement side, the big issues are that one, uh, there's very little incentive institutionally, either internally or within like the sort of broader military industrial complex of industries and companies that support the military production and procurement to control costs. And there's also, making matters worse, very little guardrails or pressures to to kill a program that's failing. So you end up with tons and tons of money being essentially wasted. But it gets even worse when you look at programs that are currently active, where you have, as you pointed out before, like our sort of mid-range ballistic missiles that we were sending over to Ukraine. We've depleted our existing stockpile. I think it's exposed to an extent when people imagine, when we say we have we spend this more than anyone else, we've got the best military and biggest military in the world. They imagine that every year we're making a ton of like hardware that we're like stockpiling in the event that we need it. But in reality, we're sort of following that sort of
Inertia? Inertia?
But it's not even inertia. It's deliberate. It's the bringing sort of just in time production efficiency to military procurement, where maximizing shareholder value, minimizing cost, preventing basically like overcapacity in and having overcapacity, like basically having a surge capacity in place. All these things have negative impacts on like sort of on shareholder value more than anything else. So in the pursuit of sort of the profit mode of a lot of these companies, the way that they do production has changed drastically from how you would imagine it during sort of like wartime.
And I guess the revolving door between generals and the defense companies has a lot to do with that. That brings me to the point I was mentioning before about the strategy, because in theory, you should be spending on what you expect to use in case of war. And for instance, we know from the Ukraine war that we are behind the Russians on hypersonic missiles and electronic warfare, and yet we are spending in the F-47. Is that reasonable?
I mean, we're definitely like I'm like so, like they have like I wouldn't say that they're strictly ahead of us. Certainly not in hypersonic missiles. Like what the advantage they have there is that like their comparative advantage is in sort of producing a larger number of worse products, which you know I is uh, falls into that into the old military adage that quantity has a certain quality of its own,
But
and
it's
so
not just quantity, because there was, I don't know how it is right now, but has been a sustained period in which the Russians could jam the HIMARS and they made the ineffective. That was reported in Business Insight and other publications. At least we have not beaten the Russians in electronic warfare so far, right?
well, I mean, we weren't giving Ukraine our best stuff. Like, I think that like if it were us against them, they would like they're spoofing. They would not be able to spoof our interceptors if or rockets if we were shooting at them. But uh, I mean, like the ultimately, it's not really the technological advantage there for like these larger ticket items. It's the need to be able to maintain, as I said earlier, like a volume of fire. And like the fighting, for example, with the Houthis, like proved that like you can't really do that with most of our uh like sort of standard weapons platforms that we use on like our naval fleet to project power. It's like if you need to every time you're shooting off a missile, it's like a huge expense, and it's going to not can't be immediately replaced. That's a huge problem if it isn't delivering, decisive results. And
Uh,
that's the real, like, that's where like a lot of these bigger issues come into play. It's why talking about things like artillery like are going to matter more as time passes, especially if we talk about sort of like battle with a near peer power like Russia, or more more pressingly in probably in like from our grand strategy standpoint, China, where there's going to be a radically larger amount of uh, opponents to chew through, so to speak, like in a conflict scenario. But I mean, like that's where getting back to procurement, like just our readiness for those sorts of things is just so radically behind not only where it should be, but behind where it seems most people, and including people in government, seem to like think we are. And I say that because anyone who had even like a vague understanding of sort of U.S. military like power projection capacity would not have been gunning for a fight with Iran.
let me make you one final question about procurement here in the United States. If you had to eliminate one program or reduce one program and move funds to another program, which trade-off would you prefer? Probably a Golden Dome, but
Yeah,
but
I mean, like, well, if
what would
accounting
you
goes,
favor? What do you believe needs more funding in defense?
I mean, yeah, I'd probably kill Golden Dome. And I'd probably kill most of the next generation naval, like shipbuilding like plans, like the designs of the like that have all sort of failed. Like the littoral combat ship, which was supposed to be sort of like the future of the Navy, has been quietly sort of shuttered. But there's other sort of next gen ships that are being built, like being designed that are I think are just going to be ruinously expensive for no great reason. Like the next generation aircraft carrier is just creating a new, larger, more expensive target. Those are things that I would do. But in terms of like where they need to invest, I mean, just investing in having the stockpiles of material, supplies, and also like logistical craft, like to be able to execute like a military operation on a sustained basis in one of the places where we'd be fighting a near peer power. So like if you're looking at if looking towards like China in particular, like one of the things that the U.S. like desperately needs to increase and that no one talks about is like, our tanker fleet, like the ability to refuel ships in combat or near combat zones at scale. Like we currently, if you deploy basically our entire available like tanker fleet capacity to the South China Sea, it would still only be able to sustain like the full like a full scale military operation of the U.S. for maybe weeks tops. Like if you were lucky, and then you're talking about having to withdraw naval resources
to
because they
refuel.
can't be fighting. Yeah, so it's like it's those basic stuff that is like that has been neglected that needs to be fixed because it doesn't matter how good your missiles are, how like cool your soldiers or how good their optics are on their weapons if you can't maintain your presence in the battle space at all, like from a like the base from like on something so basic as fueling, like you're doing it wrong. You know, and I think that's where like we have to
And what
like
you say is to keep stockpiles. What are specifically are you talking about? Artillery and drones?
mhm. Drones would be one. And that's actually like drones are like a sort of like the one area where like significantly greater investment probably should happen. Like I was quite shocked at how quickly the Navy sort of tried to pull this on. Like one of the things that they've realized following the sort of neutering of the Russian Navy by small scale, uh, both manned and unmanned boats and drones, uh, just kind of completely neutralizing the Russian fleet and boxing them up in their ports, is that drones are much more key to not only attacking ships but also will be to defending them. So one of the things the Navy's actually working on, one of the next gen programs they want to do, which hopefully doesn't just turn into a nest feathering boondoggle, but is to basically create more or less micro factories on board aircraft carriers that can produce drone swarms in short order to basically act as screeners against incoming fire. Which, if like very very speculative and early stage at this point, but if they can pull that off, that could massively increase the survivability of especially our carrier fleet,
Uh,
because
and something people sometimes neglect is that the media sometimes neglects is that the drones is not just about creating these flying bombs. It's also about intelligence gathering, so you can see where to target your artillery and drones,
yeah.
explosive drones, right?
Yeah, and even more crudely, like just getting in the way of an enemy projectile and getting hit in its place. And like or like throwing off enemy radar. Like that's what I mean by like. So there's I mean like drones have a ton of potential utility in a whole bunch of different areas that are like America. It all and they all play to America's natural advantages and our strategic advantages, technologically, that it's kind of shocking in a lot of ways that we haven't leaned into it nearly as much as we could have. And it's part of that is because militaries almost always trained to fight the last war, and even when they know that, and even when they talk about that, they're still they often find themselves still doing it. Um, yeah, it took like we spent decades more or less reorganizing our military uh, to basically on a permanent war footing against irregular and asymmetric opponents like ISIS and terrorist organizations. We spent so long reorganizing our military along those fronts, essentially ignoring right like the virtually discounting the potential existence or potential of like a regional power rival, even as we saw countries like Russia and China building their militaries with a very clear eye towards opposing us, like in a regional context. It's, and I think politically we were able to get away with that domestically because people still believed that this like the story that was like, oh, our military is the biggest, we're the best, we spend more than anyone else, so like who can possibly face us? And the answer, is that like you don't have to, if someone may spend less, but if they spend smarter than you, like that's a problem for you. But even more so when the ambitions of these regional opponents are much narrower than ours. Like we have a global view towards the projection of military power and our uh, role within the world order. Even China, in its most ambitious mind frame, really only imagines itself controlling its sphere within the sort of call it like Eastern Pacific, right? Like the area of the Pacific. Like they don't have they don't have a grand view of themselves being the global hegemon. Like even in their, even if America were to,
In trade terms, they do. In military terms, they don't. And that you wanted to bring to our attention something about China. Do you remember from our last conversation?
uh, probably. I mean, I'm not sure which I've got lots of things to bring to attention about China, but I think the main things being on that front that they seem to be, at least posturing whether they'll do it or not, like to make their biggest move would be against Taiwan, and we're not terribly well prepared to assist in the law, like in without like pretty heavy losses and none of the logistics train that we need to do that properly. The plus side is that Taiwan would be a very difficult nut for China to crack on its own. But I think like the biggest positive thing with China, like from our perspective, long term, is they're just a gradual long term demographic decline, which is something that most people don't really think about because it's sort of in the popular imagination now, right? That like China is constantly growing its population, keeps going up. The Chinese are, like sort of and like that, like sort of that their human capital is an endlessly exhaustible resource. And so I think sort of one of the things that people sort of imagine, and I think that's a a false assumption that in some ways,
In
I
the
think,
long term, right? In the long
yeah,
term, because
yeah.
right now they still have their population is the last one.
Oh, they have, yeah, they have the population they have. It's the same thing with like that it's the same issue with when we face with Russia. It's like
Mhm.
Russia's demographically doomed long term, but that doesn't change the fact that they have plenty of people right now to do what they want to do. So we have to think in those terms. But what I would like, and part of what our project is at overall in looking at the in sort of broad terms is to try to contextualize the near term, and by near term I mean problems of the next decade,
Mhm.
in the context of acting on them with an eye towards the future that we have within our grasp if we don't fail. And by we I mean America, but and by that I mean like the U.S. It's the only like major developed country without a demography problem. Uh, even with crackdowns on immigration and making us somewhat less attractive, Uh, like comparatively, in like to how we may have been a few years ago, like we're still in many ways the only game in town when it comes to, financial markets. Like even there, we're like things like whittling away the uh securities law doesn't doesn't change the fact that our capital markets are and will always be the deepest because the alternatives just don't exist. So thinking in those sort of law, what I would like, what our project is to try to take that and say like, okay, so we have these near-term challenges, but we also have this massive opportunity, and so we should be making our policy today for that future, that not only the future that we'd like to see, but the future that we know even without like basically, agnostic to our actions, what the future will look like. So actions can we take today to make that future more amenable to us? And from the U.S. position of the U.S., basically the only enemy that can destroy us is ourselves. Like we can, and it's the current administration in some ways seems to be doing a bit of a speed run on uh damaging like US prestige, undermining parts of the international order that we built for like largely for our own use and benefit, uh which are unfortunate, but uh not unsalvageable. And thinking in the context of that, there is none of current near peer powers that oppose us can supplant us. So the real issue is like, what does American leadership look like in 50 years, and and how do we sort of extend the American century? Uh,
That brings me to 2 points before moving to counterinsurgency. Is that number one is that we still, or the mass media has portrayed the worst case scenario as a war with Russia. And I believe that's not the worst case scenario. A worst case scenario, it would be a war with Russia plus China, because China still has the financial backs to keep Putin's military machine rolling and rolling for years. Because yeah, but Putin has nuclear weapons. Yes, but he was not going to use them because otherwise he would spoil Xi Jinping's dreams of dominating the global south in a couple of decades. So he's not going to use. Xi Jinping thinks more like a sociopath, but Putin thinks more like a psychopath. And that's something that is normally neglected. What's your take?
um, I mean, war with Russia and China is definitely worse than war with Russia alone. But I think we've really messed up if we end up in a like hot war with either of them, but Russia in particular. Like, there's no need for us to do that,
Yeah,
and to enter into that war would welcome China to. I doubt that they would. If China thought it was getting too hot, they'd probably wait to see how it played out, because it's to their advantage for Russia to get depleted and for us too, and they don't need to get dragged into it probably. Uh,
yeah. As far as I see, China would not take that military option unless the regime is at risk. And the only way the regime could be at risk is if the deflation, because they cook their numbers about growth, the deflation gets out of hand. And the other point is that something you have mentioned, I believe, is that how we have neglected the rules-based system we inherited from FDR and let these rules-based system to be eroded and to pave the ground for Trump to challenge it with tariffs and challenges to international court and etc. etc.
yeah, yeah. I mean, there's if I don't see really any scenario that doesn't require like very significant like rethink of everything if the US were to or Europe even to like engage in a war with Russia. So I don't think it's in anyone's interest, and I don't think it's anyone wants that. So I think when people talk about like, Russian nukes, like they're feeding into sort of Putin's propaganda in the sense of like it's essentially gives Russia what they want, which is getting to use their nuclear capability as a political boogeyman for people. Which I mean, it is a war involving nuclear weapons, like everyone loses, but the people who get like all like very scared of it, I think it's like it's the same sort of incorrect thinking that makes people like also fear that like should Ukraine fall suddenly all the Baltics are going to get rolled up by Russia because it simply neglects the fact that you know there is a material difference between being a NATO country and not a NATO country.
And Putin realizes that if he launched probably even a tactic nuclear weapon, most probably Xi Jinping would turn his back on him.
Oh, everyone would. Yeah, I mean, it would make them a pariah,
Yeah,
and it could like probably turn a not small number of like Russians against him. Like,
I know
you
that
know,
would be the end of his regime.
yeah. So like, I don't see it happening. And like, if it does, we'll have enough lead time, but like that would require like a pretty radical deterioration of the situation and a complete failure of leadership on like external as well, like to like prevent that from happening.
Now, you're moving to counterinsurgency is you mentioned before that we are always preparing to fight the last war and not the future war. But it's not just that. That sometimes we refuse to learn the lessons of history. Uh, Vietnam was an insurgency, basically. The Viet Cong, supported by the North Vietnam, but it was an insurgency. Iraq was an insurgency. They didn't have air forces or navies or no. They were just guerrillas. The same case in Afghanistan. Same case in Palestine. And yet we insist in keeping fighting those wars as if they were conventional wars. Um, Basically, when you see counterinsurgency, you see three cases. One in which the insurgents don't have popular support. For instance, the Bader-Meinhof in Germany or the Shining Path in Peru after 1985. Or in that case, all you need is to degrade the guerrillas, military action, without alienating the population, and that is a matter of using intelligence as the special forces to hunt down the terrorist cells. In the case they have popular support, then there is a problem because you have to provide a political solution. Otherwise, sooner or later, the insurgents are going to win. And the third case is the Chechnya or the Latin or Central America in the 80s, where you practically you destroy the insurgents, but by also destroying or turning those states into failed states. And in the case of Palestine, we are precisely inadvertently we are moving to the third option because we keep supporting Netanyahu in his very self-serving plan to fight the war against Hamas as if it were a conventional war. Is that correct?
Uh, I mean, like, I don't think. I think that like the case in like if we're discussing Gaza in particular, I don't think it's a case either of counterinsurgency or conventional war. It's systematic annihilation. It's a completely
Mhm.
different. It's a very different and dangerous in the sense that it's uh, done more to damage American like prestige in the world than than basically any other conflict. Like that, and it's been a like going to be a black stain on like the reputation of the United States for a long time to come. I mean, like country, like it's not using old tactics. It's like a system. It's Israel doing exactly what they what they want, which is to terrorize, destroy, and make life completely unlivable in the area with a goal towards ultimately expelling anyone who survives. They've made that fairly clear.
Let me be more precise, even though I have talked a lot, but I believe Netanyahu is just using consciously the effects of use of approaching this war as a conventional war to with for self-serving purposes, but is using that in order to reward his coalition. But yes, so it makes no sense. Insurgencies so the rule. I could mention several characteristics of an insurgency, but basically, if you fight an insurgency, number one, you have to separate them from the population. You cannot punish the population for the sins of the insurgents, and that's exactly what Netanyahu is doing with Hamas. Excuse me, with Palestine.
Oh yeah, I mean, well, I mean, it's not punishment. It's like it's a pretext for annihilation.
Mhm. Collective punishment.
Yeah, I mean, it's not collective punishment. It's seeing them as squatters on their land and intending to remove them. There's no punishment, so to speak, involved. It's a conscious, like call it imperial project if you want, like where it's a pretext for taking territory. It's so it's not a it's so it's it's not an excuse to punish them because like yes the Palestinians are collectively being punished in that sense, but it's far beyond collective punishment.
What happens is that before the public Israeli public opinion is a collective punishment for October 7th. At the level of his coalition, of course not. It's just a bold attempt of using October 7th just to displace Gazans and Palestinians in the West Bank to reward their supporters with land, the settlers.
Sorry, can you say that again?
At the level of public opinion, is collective punishment for October 7th. And the Israeli opposition has made a terrible job to use, for instance, the Olmer plan as the basis for a new narrative. At the level of government, Netanyahu is the war is basically an excuse to using October 7 as an excuse to reward his followers with land in the West Bank and Gaza, the settlers.
Yeah, I mean, like like yeah, like to an extent. I mean, like it is like fits with like it's like a part of the ultra right wings like who he needs to like maintain powers like ambition. So like he is rewarding them in that sense for sure. And yeah, like it is absolutely popular with the settlers who are moving in and taking over, dispossessing people of their like of the land that they legally own. Yeah, it's a very blunt, it's very nasty, but it's also important to recognize that you know um uh it isn't just Netanyahu. I mean, I am like um, like the whole series of polls that have come out in the last couple months show like pretty strong majorities of Israeli Jews supporting expulsion of the Palestinians entirely from Gaza.
Yeah,
So
but yes, but that's because of the stupidity of the Israeli opposition. Because so far the alternative is not a multilateral occupation force that overhauls the Palestinian Authority, kicks Fatah and Hamas out of the game, so they cannot repeat what happened in 2006. What the Israeli opinion see is a ceasefire with Hamas, the perpetrators of October 7th. And that has helped to make much more difficult any proposal that includes a two-state solution, right?
I mean, if you look at the two sort of like Palestinian enclaves, like you have Gaza, which are, you know, allegedly run by terrorists, and then you have the West Bank, which the Palestinian Authority, you know, like does its best to comply with Israeli directives, but even there, people are being dispossessed. It's it's the problem. The problem is that it isn't a matter of terrorists running the government. The terrorists are the Israelis in this context. Like they're and that's like pretty unambiguous. I mean, more people have been killed waiting for food aid in the last couple of months than were killed in the entirety of October 7th. Like the pretext is so thin as to be, an absurdity. The gossamer strand that can be blown away by the lightest wind. It's it's not a war, it's not a counterinsurgency, it's a targeted destruction of a people. And and that's why, like they resist. It's the Israeli, what you refer to as like Israeli stupidity, in not having multilateral like takeover falls to, like, like the problem with that is that they don't consider it stupid because from their perspective, the last thing they want is someone stopping them slaughtering Palestinians. And they're gonna push and push and push until someone stops them.
But if I am a Jewish Israeli and the only proposal you sent me is a proposal in which I have to negotiate with Hamas, then probably especially if I am not well informed, probably I'm going to be opposed to the Palestinians because the opposition has not bothered to present an alternative. To win at least in the narrative, right? And what
I mean,
brings
from my
me
perspective, as an like the American position should be, to pardon my French, to tell the Israelis too fucking bad. Like this is what's happening. Like it's with the ultimate the ultimate problem here is that all of this, every single thing that's happening there, is completely predicated on U.S. support for Israel. Like they couldn't get away with anything that they're doing. They couldn't do anything that they're doing if we told them no, but we refused to tell them no.
That brings me to my last question is we have books about counterinsurgency. We have the experience. It was probably was not perfect, but good enough of portrayals in the Sunni awakening. We know how an insurgency works and how to solve. We know that we have the experience of the Good Friday Agreement in the case of Ireland. So we have enough experience in counterinsurgency to know what works and what doesn't. And yet, here in the United States, especially the Democratic Party, doesn't seem aware of that. You see, here in the United States, the Palestinian issue is seen as a sport competition where you have to root for one team or the other. When you perfectly can side with the Palestinians and Israelis and against Netanyahu and Hamas. And that has calcified, for instance, in the case of Israel, and have kept the debate going nowhere in the case of the United States. Why is the Democratic Party so inept to articulate a new Palestine narrative that tries to correct the mistakes made by the Biden administration?
Well, the answer is simple. Like it's like, you could boil it down to one word, APAC, but like more broadly, the total compromising of U.S. political institutions by the state of Israel is a pretty like severe problem. Like the shrieking and crying about like Russian interference and dark money in our elections, like completely elides the fact that the Israel lobby in the United States has become so overwhelmingly powerful with the leadership of Congress and with the political parties, like leadership on both parties, that neither is even able to countenance like the idea of an alternative solution. I mean, like look at any of the political leadership. Basically no one has criticized from the Democratic Party like the ongoing slaughter to speak of. Only what, six Congress people voted against the latest weapons shipment to Israel.
Yeah,
There's
the Marjorie Taylor Greene.
yeah, and it's
Post.
not. Yeah, it's and like you have to. You know the situation has got to be pretty bad when she's the one who's sounding sane, and it's like it is like perverse that we have reached a point where the U.S. is so compromised in that way, and I think it's like a real like stain on us. Like I mean, Israel is supposed to, like the whole point of Israel when it was set up when we set up the American sort of alliance with Israel and our backing for them was that they were supposed to be an island of stability in the region, a democratic country that we could work with. Instead, they've become a pariah that's inflicting a genocide on a subject people that they're like in a engaging in not a top down, not a government led, but a popularly supported campaign of destruction against. And the fact
Yeah,
that
but
we
I can understand that reason as an explanation for the case of the establishment, either because IPAC's influence in primaries or because they are afraid, the Democrats are always afraid of something, afraid of being called weak on Israel. But even in the case of the left, you see these, they just wave these little flags and they make their temper tantrums. Can they come up with something that makes sense in terms of counterinsurgency?
so yes, in the sense that the Good Friday Agreement, using that example, like worked because America came in as a sort of new like the an arbiter that could be seen as honest by both sides and which had cultural and political ties to both countries and was seen as a fair dealer. The US has completely abrogated any possibility of that role on its own in the current in the current environment because we have backed to the hilt every escalation and like undertaken by the Israeli government and calling it
But that's
self-defense.
precisely why Democrats should, or at least the left side of the Democratic Party, should try to propose something that makes sense in terms of counterinsurgency, because the press is also as mediocre as the Democratic Party on that end. So if you, when I learned from the Olmer's plan, the updated version from the Times of Israel, and before that from the Vatican News and Le Monde. And but practically those alternatives, there is a plan for a federalized option in foreign affairs, but the mainstream media went silent. It was just a competition. What's your team, Israel or Palestine? Who are you rooting for, right?
Well, I think part of the problem there, is that it is currently a situation where it isn't two sides to speak of. Like it isn't a fight between two sides, and I think it is like it's not a matter of saying like, oh, like why are we picking sides? Because like America had like the American leadership has picked a side. The American people, as like increasingly aren't big fans of the side that's been taken and would like to like have the conversation change. And I think that the in the absence of the ability to articulate, like to even have good faith conversations about alternatives, the only method politically is to take a more what call it pro Palestine perspective, because I think most people are on the side of Palestine insofar as they do not want Palestine to be destroyed and the Palestinian people destroyed. I don't think that most of the people who support or would say free Palestine, for example, like who would shout that, I don't think any of those people are saying free Palestine and like allow, like Hamas and like to run a terrorist state out of it. What they're saying is free them from the obvious tyranny and terror under which they are living. So I think there's a difference there. I mean, like that's why like being pro-Israel is
I
different as well.
I understand. Yet, unless somebody presents me a much better way, precisely the Olmer proposal aim precisely in that direction and make was a
Uh-huh.
reasonable way to implement it. And yet, Democrats, the media, doesn't seem interested. They want to a peace that is the lasting peace that is crafted by Netanyahu and Hamas, the two parties that are more interested in killing that peace. Well, I know you have to do something else, so
Yeah, I mean, the last
I
thing I would say on that is like the problem is like the solution would be for America to lead a like international coalition to like occupy and rebuild Gaza and create a buffer zone that protects both Gaza and West Bank uh, lands. The problem is Israel does not want that and will oppose that bitterly, so it would have to be imposed on them. And so the question is, given that we have failed to impose even the most minor of restrictions on what Israel has done, do we have the ability or will to assert ourselves there? I think that the popular will may be there, but the political will amongst the ruling elite, who, if they're forced to engage with it, becomes a problem. I think there's also an issue there in itself, and I think it bleeds down to the entire American people, but like to the political leadership cast more so, is the fact that this genocide has been live streamed. Like, you can't hide what has happened, and so the strategy seems to have been in some ways that the only way out is through, sort of basically keep doubling down. The problem is, eventually you're going to go broke, and eventually, by that I mean, like, eventually the popular will just simply not allow it anymore. The question is how many Palestinians will be left at that point. But when that happens, whenever it happens, the bill will come due for us, in the sense that we'll have to, at least in some way, uh, you know, uh, take a internal inventory and accounting of our culpability in it. I think for a lot of people, that is more terrifying than dead children, like having to take responsibility for it. I think that's one of the big blockers to taking action now, because if we took action now, you could ask the politicians like who make that decision, like, you were in office for the last 10 years, like, why didn't you do this sooner? Like, why now? And like, they won't get they'll get some credit, at least they hope that, like, they'll hope to, but they know that there's also the risk that even acknowledging it
and
will end their careers, basically.
and hopefully both of us, the New Hegemony Institute and, well, this is a small channel, will help people connect the dots and make those mediocre politicians accountable.
Hopefully.
And hopefully. And thank you for your time. It's I understand there is more details to talk about to show how little sense Netanyahu's war makes in terms of counterinsurgency. That for those who don't care about Palestinians, but if you care about Israel, you should at least care that the strategy implemented by Netanyahu makes sense in terms of counterinsurgency.
I mean, yeah,
Otherwise, who is
yeah.
benefiting from the war, right?
But also, if
Netanyahu.
you care, like, here's my thing: is if you care about Israel and Jews, more generally, like, you should, people should want to, like, pull the choke chain here, because in the first instance where the American media and, like, well, like, has done its best to make it uh to conflate anti-Zionism with anti-Semitism, has done probably just incalculable damage to the Jewish people, because when you're forced to say, okay, oh, so all Jews are pro genocide, becomes the conclusion. Huge problem for that people as a whole, but also just more generally as Israel as a national project. Like, whatever the outcome now, there is no real normalization with its neighbors or with the region or with much of the world. And the moment America's protective aegis and ability to project power globally is diminished at all, puts Israel and Israel's survival at much higher risk, because they've been terrorists like to the rest of the region, invading other countries, taking bits of them, like absolutely uh, ripping up and throwing away all basic precepts of international law. That when they can't, when if it ever comes to the point, which in the long history of the world it almost certainly will, that they can't do that with impunity, they're going to like reap what they sow.
If they ethnically cleanse the Palestine, we could revert to the times of the PLO that target the Jewish interests around the world.
Yeah, and I mean they're inviting, like they basically invited that by like trying to tie the Zionist project to Judaism as writ large. And
This is more than a Zionist, more a Kahanist model. This rabbit, no values, no prisoners taken version of Zionism.
Right. I mean, yeah. I mean, it's a mutated version. It's like a mutated version of Zionism that's sort of taken, evolved down a maximalist path for decades. But yeah, I mean, like, it is again a demography is destiny type of story where the people who talk there's like a very clear reason why the Israelis will never allow the Palestinians to have equal civil rights in Israel is simply the fact that their birth rate is higher. Like the Palestinians will outnumber them eventually, and that's anathema to the Israeli project, to the Zionist project writ large. So they have to be dealt with. And the tragedy is that it's happening, like it's not happening in some far eastern camps that no one knows about and that there's plausible deniability. It's being live streamed and we're still doing nothing. Like the never again mantra is just so hollow now, where we said never again to a thing that we couldn't know was happening at the scale it was happening, and yet we do now here, and it's done nothing.
I believe we could retake probably in a few weeks this issue because Netanyahu is replicating in Syria exactly what he has replicated in Lebanon, what he has tried to replicate in Iran, and that could be the issue just for one discussion by itself. And give me a couple or 3 weeks to prepare a document about immigration, the document I promised you.
Sure.
With your input as New Hegemony Institute, I can move it forward to see if we can together do something to reset the debate on also in this issue that is vital and yet has been neglected. Well, for the very same reason, we have a mediocre political class.
Yeah, I mean, like, that's probably a subject for another time. I'm happy to discuss about again, and hopefully have fewer when we have fewer interruptions, or should I say delays to our next conversation.
Yeah, hopefully, but no, I believe the ideas have been presented, and we have shown the ideas that normally the mass media neglects because they are focused on the photo ops, focused on the Trump's declarations, and they neglect what is behind. For instance, it's very sad that I have not pretty much read any article that presents the Palestinian conflict in terms of counterinsurgency, and that says a lot.
Well, yeah, I mean, it's them telling on themselves. It's because they know it's not a counterinsurgency. So you can't characterize it in those terms.
Well, and it also something we have no time. I will try to do it much better next time, is to present what we understand for counterinsurgency, because that by itself sometimes people understand by counterinsurgency the School of Americas or something like on those terms, and no, that's not. That's one version of counterinsurgency that leads you to the brutal solutions like the Second Chechen War or the Central America of the 1980s and failed states. Well, John,
or the camel tiger. So,
let's meet again in a few weeks, and thank you very much for your time for now. We have already an issue to talk about next time.
Yeah, for sure. All right. Talk to you later. Bye.
Bye.